The wind swept hard across the wide plain as though the land wanted to test the strength of anyone who dared to cross it. And along that lonely road where the dirt clung to the soulless of the desperate and the horizon stretched endless as a broken dream, a woman moved forward with the stubborn rhythm of someone who had forgotten what comfort felt like, but not yet forgotten how to breathe. Her steps uneven, her clothes torn, her throat aching with thirst, her stomach empty as though a hole had been carved inside it. Yet her eyes, though tired and red, carried a flicker that would not die, a spark that had survived betrayal, hunger, and the cruel indifference of the world. And as the sun sagged low, painting the sky in molten amber and fading crimson, she saw a figure ahead, not a ghost of memory this time, not a shadow she invented to keep herself walking, but a man solid, broad, unmoving, standing with the authority of one who belonged to the land itself. A cowboy, though she did not know his name, his story, or his soul, only that the sight of him rooted her to the ground, because in his stance there was no invitation, only challenge. In the tilt of his hat there was no softness, only shadow. And when his eyes, sharp as steel, found hers across the distance, she almost turned to flee, but her legs were too weak, and the thought of running was more laughable than safe. So she stood, breathing shallow, waiting for him to speak, waiting for judgment or dismissal. But what came was stranger than either, for he stepped closer, boots pressing dust into the earth like punctuation, marks in a sentence too long unfinished. And when he was near enough that she could see the sweat at the hollow of his throat, the calluses on his hands, and the weight of years on his face, he stopped, studied her with a gaze that neither pitied nor condemned, and spoke with a voice rough as dry stone dragged across itself. "You can work for food, or be my wife." Words that dropped into the silence like stones into a still pond, words that seemed less an offer and more a verdict, as if he had weighed her already and found her place in his world. And though they stung with bluntness, though they sounded cruel in their lack of poetry, she recognized something inside them that her heart, starved for honesty, could not deny. There was truth there, sharp and naked, the truth of survival. And survival was all she had ever asked from life these past months. So her lips parted as if to protest, to ask questions, to bargain. But no sound came, only the dry crackle of her throat. And so she stared at his hand when he extended it, a hand wide and scarred, the map of every year he had worked the land pressed into its skin, a hand that looked capable of striking, of building, of breaking. And in that strange, suspended silence, her breath shallow and the sun pressing its dying heat into her back, she felt the ghosts of her past faces that had mocked her, voices that had abandoned her, promises that had turned to ash and before fear or pride could raise their stubborn walls. Her body made the choice, her mind was too slow to argue, and she lifted her hand, trembling, and set it into his without a word. And in that instant something in the world shifted, something unspoken sealed itself between them, a contract neither of them fully understood yet, but both felt the weight of. For his eyes narrowed as though testing her resolve, and hers softened as though daring herself to believe. And together they stood a moment longer, to broken edges pressing against each other, sharp enough to cut, strong enough to hold. He did not smile, nor did she, for this was no moment of romance, not yet, only necessity written in flesh and dust. But he turned, wordless, his grip firm around her hand, and led her down the road toward a stretch of land that waited behind, weather-beaten fences and leaning barns, a ranch that wore the years as honestly as the man who owned it, a place where the wooden posts had grown gray with storms, where the fields stretched long and weary under the sun, where silence was interrupted only by the low groan of cattle or the distant cry of hawks. And as they walked, she glanced at him, at the slow, steady strength in his stride, the way he did not look back to check if she followed, because in his mind, once a hand was taken, it was held until it was broken. And though a part of her bristled at the arrogance, another part found comfort in it, for the world had given her nothing but uncertainty. And here, in his silence, there was something solid, something that would not bend to her weakness. And she found herself wanting to believe that maybe, just maybe, this blunt, strange bargain was the closest thing to salvation she would ever be offered. As the sky deepened into violet and stars began to blink awake above them, they reached the ranch, its outline against the horizon sharp and lonely. A house of wood and stone that looked both shelter and prison, depending on the eyes that judged it. And she hesitated at the threshold, her feet refusing to move forward as the weight of what she had agreed to settled into her bones. But he did not coax her, did not explain, only released her hand and pushed open the door, stepping inside without looking back, leaving it to her to decide if she belonged to hunger on the road, or to whatever life waited within those walls. And though her body shook, though her mind screamed, she followed, because she had already chosen, and choices, once made, could not be undone. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and leather, of old meals cooked long ago, of a life built without company, and she stood still, glancing at the sparse furniture, the rifle mounted on the wall, the boots by the door, the table scarred with knife marks, and she realized she had stepped not into a home, but into a fortress of solitude, a place carved for one man alone, and yet now it would hold two. And that thought tightened her chest with fear and something else she could not yet name. But when he turned, removing his hat, his dark hair falling in rough waves across his forehead, he looked at her not with warmth but with a quiet measure, as though studying a horse before trusting it. And he said simply, "You'll eat tonight. Work starts tomorrow." Words so flat, so ordinary, yet to her ears they sounded like the promise of another sunrise. And she nodded, silent, too tired to argue, too hungry to resist. And as she lowered herself into a chair and waited while he set a plate before her, plain bread and beans, but more than she had seen in days, she felt tears prick her eyes, not from pity, not from kindness, but from the raw fact that she was alive, that she had been offered food. And in this moment, that was enough. Her hands trembled as she lifted the bread, her teeth sinking into its coarse crust. And though it was rough, though the beans were plain, it tasted like salvation, like something sacred, and she ate with a ferocity that embarrassed her. But he said nothing, only sat across from her, chewing slowly, his eyes lowered, as if granting her the dignity of not being watched. And in that silence, she found herself strangely grateful, for kindness often came clothed in pity. But his silence wrapped her in a different kind of mercy, the kind that acknowledged her hunger without turning it into shame. When the plate was empty, when her stomach ached from fullness she had not felt in so long, she sat back, staring at the flicker of the lamp, and wondered what tomorrow would bring, wondered what kind of work, what kind of life, what kind of bond had been forged in that single touch of hands on the road. And though fear gnawed at her, though doubt whispered, exhaustion won. And when he rose and showed her to a small room, the bed narrow and rough but real, she lay down, her body sinking, her mind finally letting go. And in the quiet of that room she let the tears fall, soft, unmarked by sound, because tomorrow she would need to be strong again. But tonight, for the first time in too long, she was not starving, not freezing, not abandoned on the road. And that was enough to let her believe, if only for a moment, that she had stepped into a different fate. The wind pressed against the walls outside, as if it wanted to remind her of the wild world beyond the door. But inside, with the rough blankets and the steady hum of the ranch settling into night, there was a fragile, trembling safety. And as she drifted on the edge of sleep, she imagined the long hours ahead, the chores, the labor, the unspoken tests of endurance. But for now, the world was quiet, her stomach was full, and for the first time, she felt that the weight she carried on her shoulders could rest, if only for a night. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew that survival could be more than mere endurance, that it could be a cautious hope, wrapped in the hands of someone who did not ask for thanks. And in that silent, suspended night, the first thread of trust began to stitch itself between them, fragile as a spider's web glinting in the dying light. And though she would not say the words aloud, she let herself imagine waking to a day where perhaps she belonged somewhere, where perhaps the road behind her was just a memory and the path ahead was not empty. For the first time in months, she did not feel completely alone, and that, she realized as the shadows shifted in her small room and the wind softened against the walls, was enough to close her eyes and let sleep, weary and unguarded, finally claim her, wrapping her in a quiet promise that the morning might bring more than hunger, more than toil, more than the ghost she carried. And that in a world of harsh roads and broken hearts, sometimes salvation arrived not in words, but in the simple act of a hand held steady, of food placed before empty stomachs, and a roof that did not ask questions. And for now, that was everything. Dawn crept slowly across the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gold, and in that fragile light, the ranch seemed less like a fortress and more like a living world, stretching wide and weary under the morning sun. And she awoke to the quiet rhythm of the land, the faint clatter of hooves, the low moan of the wind through the fences, and the smell of leather and hay. And though her body ached from the long hours of walking, and the weight of nights spent hungry and alone, she rose, pulling on the clothes he had set aside for her, rough and worn, but clean enough to signal a new beginning. And as she stepped out into the yard, she saw him already at work, his broad shoulders moving with precise rhythm as he tended to the horses. And for a moment she hesitated, unsure where to start, unsure if she had the strength, the courage, or the knowledge to meet his expectations. But he did not call her name, did not order her around, only glanced briefly in her direction with eyes that measured and weighed without cruelty. And she understood, without words, that the work itself would be her teacher, and that she would learn through movement, through repetition, through sweat and patience. And so she approached the barn slowly, her hands trembling not from fear but from the anticipation of labor, of usefulness, of belonging. And as she brushed the dust from the hay and lifted the bales, she felt muscles she had forgotten ache and strain. And though her body protested, her mind felt alive in a way it had not in months, the sheer exertion chasing away the ghosts of hunger, of rejection, of empty roads and endless skies. And she stole a glance at him from across the yard, at the way he moved with authority without hurry, how each motion carried purpose, how he seemed to understand the language of the land itself. And in that glance, she recognized the strange comfort of structure, of rules and labor that demanded everything she had but gave back, something she had lost: dignity, skill, the simple affirmation of being needed, being capable, being alive. The sun climbed higher, burning away the chill of dawn, and he called her name only once, a low, rolling sound that carried neither impatience nor scorn. And when she approached, he handed her a pitchfork without explanation, and together they moved through the pens, her awkwardness met with quiet correction, his hands never touching hers, but his presence a constant anchor, a reminder that mistakes were noted but not mocked, that effort was recognized. And as the hours passed, the rhythm of work began to stitch itself into her consciousness, the repetitive motion of lifting, feeding, sweeping, of brushing the horses' coats and cleaning the stalls, grounding her in the reality of this new life. And she found herself noticing details she had not allowed herself to see before: the sheen of a horse's mane in the morning sun, the rough grain of the barn wood under her palms, the smell of hay mixed with dust, and the faint tongue of sweat, the way the wind lifted through the corral carrying both promise and warning. And through it all, he moved near, sometimes silent, sometimes offering a single word of instruction. And though she did not yet know him, did not yet know his heart, she trusted the steadiness of his gaze, the measured cadence of his movements, the silent affirmation that she was allowed to exist here without question. And it was this quiet trust, this unspoken contract, that began to soften the tension coiled in her shoulders, that allowed her to breathe more deeply even as she worked harder than she had in months. And when midday arrived, the sun scorching the backs of her neck and shoulders, he led her to the house, wordless still, and set a simple meal before her: bread, stew, and water. And though she had learned long ago to take whatever sustenance came her way without complaint, she felt a strange warmth in the act, a recognition of care that was neither forced nor patronizing. And she ate, slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite as though in it she could taste the first trace of security she had known in years. And when she looked up, he was watching, not with judgment, not with pity, but with a calm assessment that somehow made her feel capable, worthy, present. And in that moment, she allowed herself to imagine that survival could be more than the absence of pain, that life could contain these small, quiet victories, these moments of acknowledgement, these days when hunger and fear were replaced by work and routine. And she resolved silently to meet the ranch's demands, to push herself further than she thought she could, to earn not only the food and shelter, but the quiet respect of the man who had saved her from the road. The afternoon moved like molasses, heavy with sun and toil, and she discovered muscles she had long neglected, learned to read the horses' temperaments, to anticipate their movements, to adjust her own rhythm to match theirs, and with each task completed, the ache in her body mingled with a strange satisfaction, the raw, primal reward of effort yielding tangible results. And though his eyes often followed her from across the yard, never intruding, never softening, never speaking beyond necessity, she began to sense that in his silence there was instruction, in his stillness there was affirmation, and in his presence there was a shield against the chaos of the world beyond the ranch gates. And in this realization, she felt something begin to root itself deep in her chest, a fragile, trembling connection that was not yet affection, not yet trust fully formed, but the seed of something that might grow if tended with patience, effort, and care. And she found herself curious about the man who moved through the land as though he were part of it, whose hands bore the maps of a lifetime of labor, whose eyes had seen both suffering and endurance, whose quiet offered the possibility of stability in a life that had known only flight and fear. And though she did not yet speak the words, she promised herself that she would learn, in time, how to match his strength with her own, how to meet his expectations without losing the fragile sense of self she had fought so hard to preserve. And when the sun began to drop low, streaking the sky with fire and shadow, he gathered the tools, checked the animals, and moved through the ranch with the same silent authority. And she, exhausted but unwilling to leave the yard unfinished, followed, completing the tasks left for her with careful precision. And when at last the day was done, he allowed her to step back, to release her aching muscles, to breathe. And though his words were sparse, done for today, they carried weight, a quiet acknowledgement that effort had been seen, and competence had been earned. And in that small, unadorned phrase, she felt an echo of pride, a trace of accomplishment, a tentative, fragile hope. Night fell slowly, thick with the scent of dust, animals, and wood smoke, and he led her to the house again, silent as ever, leaving her to prepare her own simple meal, but offering water and a loaf of bread as though these gestures alone were enough to communicate his expectations and his unspoken acceptance. And as she ate, her mind wandered, tracing the contours of her journey from the road to the ranch, from starvation to labor, from fear to cautious belonging. And though fatigue threatened to pull her under, she lingered over the sensation of full stomach, clean hands, a quiet roof over her head, and she allowed herself to feel the strange, thrilling sense of agency and survival, the knowledge that she was no longer entirely at the mercy of the world, that she could act, decide, endure, and that the man who had saved her, who had offered both challenge and safety, might be a guide in this uncharted territory of work, trust, and something that might one day resemble companionship. And as she cleaned the few dishes, stacked the remaining food, and prepared for the narrow, rough bed, she felt the weight of the day, the strain of new muscles and old fears. But she also felt the first flicker of confidence, a recognition that her body could do, her mind could learn, her hands could shape, her efforts could yield results. And when she finally lay down, exhaustion and relief mingling, she allowed herself to close her eyes, listening to the quiet hum of the ranch at night, to the soft stirring of animals, the rustle of the wind through fences, the distant cry of some unseen creature in the dark. And in that symphony of silence and survival, she felt the day's labors settle into her bones as a proof of her own resilience. And the strange, quiet man who had placed her here became a fixture in her mind, not a source of fear, not yet a source of warmth, but a presence, solid, steady, undeniable, whose approval she had earned not through words, but through effort, persistence, and endurance. And as sleep began to pull her under, the thought crossed her mind that tomorrow would demand more, that the work would be harder, the hours longer, the tests greater, but she would meet them, she would endure, she would survive, because for the first time in a long time, she knew that she had a place, a purpose, and the faint, almost imperceptible promise that life might contain something more than hunger, more than fear, more than endless roads and empty nights. And in that knowledge, fragile and tentative though it was, she allowed herself to rest, the first thread of hope woven into her mind, her body, her spirit, as the ranch settled into quiet darkness, and the stars blinked faintly above the endless plain, witnesses to a beginning neither easy nor certain, but real. And she, at last, surrendered to sleep, ready to face the dawn and whatever it would bring, for she had begun to belong. The morning light filtered through the small, rough window of her room, casting long, thin rays across the narrow bed where she lay, muscles still aching from the previous day's labor, and as she stretched, the stiffness in her body reminded her how far she had come from the endless, lonely road, how the empty ache in her stomach had been replaced by the weight of work, and though exhaustion still clung to her like a shadow, she felt a strange sense of accomplishment, a flicker of pride, for she had survived, and not just survived, but had met the day with hands that worked, eyes that observed, and a mind that slowly, carefully, learned the rhythm of the ranch, the language of the horses, the silent authority of the man who owned this land, who moved through the world like a shadow carved from years of toil, whose silence was not emptiness but teaching, whose gaze was not judgment but measurement. And as she rose and dressed, pulling on the worn clothes that had become her armor, she wondered what today would demand, what new lessons awaited, and she felt a strange anticipation, mingled with fear, for she knew that the work was only part of it. The other part was understanding him, the man who had saved her from the road, whose presence was both challenge and protection. And as she stepped into the yard, the crisp morning air biting at her lungs, she saw him already tending to the animals, his movements precise and efficient, and she hesitated, unsure whether to disturb him or to quietly begin her own tasks. But he looked up, just briefly, a sharp assessment in his eyes, and she understood that no words were needed, action would speak. And so she moved, lifting, sweeping, brushing, feeding, her body learning, muscles remembering, hands gaining confidence, and all the while, he observed from a distance, never speaking beyond a single word when necessary, never intruding, yet always present, a constant measure of her effort. And she began to notice details she had never before allowed herself to see, the soft flick of a horse's tail, the dust rising like mist in the morning light, the way the fence posts leaned slightly from storms long past, the faint scent of hay and sweat mixing in the warm air. And in these details, she found a rhythm, a pulse, a small, fragile joy in belonging. And when the sun climbed high, she felt the first true sense of connection to a place, to labor, to life that was not only about surviving, but about proving herself. And when he called her name, his voice low, controlled, she approached, heart hammering not with fear but with determination. And he handed her the tools, the feed, the buckets, without explanation, letting her learn through doing, through trial, through persistence. And she did, fumbling at first, struggling, but gradually gaining competence, gaining strength, gaining the quiet recognition that he never said aloud, but that she felt in every measured glance, every shift in his stance, every nod that acknowledged her growing skill. And as the hours passed, the sun blazing overhead, she worked tirelessly, sweat mixing with dust, muscles straining, lungs burning, yet her heart swelling with a sense of achievement, a knowledge that she was capable, useful, alive. And somewhere in the back of her mind, the memory of the road, the hunger, the fear, the endless emptiness faded like a dark cloud dispersing, replaced by the tangible reality of effort and result, of labor that mattered, of a life she could hold in her hands and shape with every action. When midday arrived, he finally gestured toward the house, wordless, and she followed, her stomach protesting hunger once more, but this time with anticipation rather than despair. And as she ate, simple bread and stew, she watched him, noting the subtle movements, the way he paused to observe the horses, the careful handling of tools, the small, almost imperceptible gestures that revealed the depth of his knowledge, his experience, his patience. And she realized that this man, who had seemed so harsh, so unyielding, so silent, was teaching her not just about work but about life, about resilience, about trust. And as she chewed, she allowed herself a brief, dangerous thought that perhaps survival could be more than mere existence, that perhaps life could be lived with purpose, and that perhaps he, in his quiet, unspoken way, was offering not just food and shelter, but a path towards something she had long thought impossible, belonging, stability, maybe even hope. And when she looked up, she caught his eyes on her for a fraction of a second, sharp, assessing, but not unkind. And she felt the strange heat of connection, not desire, not affection yet, only acknowledgement. And it was enough to stir a faint, trembling courage within her to continue, to push further, to endure more, to meet every challenge the day would offer, for she was no longer alone, no longer entirely at the mercy of the world, and though she would not yet speak of it, she felt the first thread of trust weaving itself between them. Delicate, invisible, but undeniably present, the afternoon stretched on, heavy with work, and she discovered the subtle lessons, hidden in routine, how to read the temperaments of the animals, how to anticipate the weight of a bucket, the sway of a horse, the timing of a feed, the silent communication between man and land, how a glance, a gesture, a pause could convey more than words ever could, and she learned to move with precision, to adjust, to anticipate, to act not from fear but from understanding, and though he spoke little, his presence was constant, a shadow of guidance, a measure against which she could test herself, and with every task completed, every chore finished, she felt a strange, deep satisfaction, the kind that comes not from praise or reward, but from knowing that she was capable, that she could endure, that she could meet the day and its trials, with hands and heart that refused to yield. And in that satisfaction, a new thought emerged, almost imperceptible, that perhaps she could claim this life as her own, not merely as a refuge, but as a place where effort was rewarded with progress, where labor gave shape to existence, and where she might, in time, find not just safety, but purpose and perhaps even belonging. As dusk approached, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges, he walked the property with her, inspecting the fences, the animals, the barns, and though he spoke only when necessary, giving instructions in measured tones, she began to see patterns, to predict his expectations, to understand the subtle nuances of ranch life, and with each observation, she grew more confident, more aware, more alive, and in the quiet of that shared labor, a bond, fragile but tangible, began to form, a bond built not on words or sentiment, but on shared effort, endurance, and recognition of mutual capability. And she found herself watching him, noticing the faint scars along his hands, the lines carved into his face by years of sun and wind, the calm steadiness in his gaze, and she wondered, not with longing but with curiosity, how a man could carry so much strength and solitude in a single body, and how, perhaps, she could learn to meet that strength with her own, not in opposition, but in understanding, in partnership, in the silent acknowledgement that survival alone was no longer enough, that life required more courage, more persistence, more connection, and perhaps even care, though care had never been safe for her before. And yet, here, it might be possible. Night fell heavy, and he showed her the routines for closing the ranch, the feeding, the locking of gates, the checks of animals, and though she stumbled at first, forgetting a step, misjudging the weight of a pail, he corrected her once, simply, firmly, without harshness, and she felt a strange rush of gratitude, for it was the first time in months that correction had not carried humiliation, only guidance, and when the chores were done, he handed her a fresh plate, the simple sustenance of the evening, and she ate, reflecting on the day, the hours of effort, the moments of connection, the lessons learned, and though fatigue threatened to pull her under, she felt a swelling pride, a quiet triumph, a recognition that she had endured, adapted, survived, and perhaps, in small, tender increments, begun to thrive. And as she lay in the narrow bed, muscles sore but spirit lifted, listening to the soft rustle of wind through the trees, the low murmur of animals settling for the night, the distant stars blinking above the endless plains, she felt the weight of the day settle into her bones, not as burden, but as proof of capability. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future where fear did not dominate, where hunger was not constant, where life could contain structure, labor, trust, and perhaps, just perhaps, something more. And as sleep claimed her, fragile, tentative, yet undeniable hope took root, threading its quiet persistence through the marrow of her being. And the ranch, the man, the animals, the wind, and the vast, unending sky became the backdrop for a story that was no longer only about survival, but about life reclaimed, strength rebuilt, and a bond forged in silence, sweat, and quiet understanding. And she, at last, surrendered to the night, ready to meet the dawn and whatever it would bring. The night settled over the ranch with a quiet, almost sacred weight, stars blinking slowly into existence above the endless plains, and she lay in the narrow bed, muscles sore but heart awake with the lessons of the day, feeling for the first time in months that survival was no longer a desperate, endless struggle, but a skill she had begun to master, a rhythm she could follow, a life she could shape with her hands. And as sleep threatened to pull her under, she thought of the man whose presence had become her anchor, not warm in the way of comfort, not tender in the way of affection, but steady, reliable, demanding, and honest in a way the world rarely offered. And she realized that the bond forming between them was fragile, invisible, yet undeniable, built on effort, endurance, mutual observation, silent correction, and the quiet acknowledgement that each had met the other halfway. And when morning came again, pale and thin, filtering through the rough window, she rose with aching limbs but with a strange, determined courage, moving through the chores with a focus sharpened by yesterday, aware of the horse's subtle cues, the cattle's slow murmurs, the shifting weight of buckets, and she noticed, almost without thought, the subtle nods and glances of the man as he watched, approving, guiding, never overbearing. And she understood that his lessons were not in words but in presence, in shared labor, in the silent measure of trust. And with every task, every correction, every small success, she felt her confidence swell, her body grow strong, her mind sharp, her spirit resilient. And by midday, when he finally gestured her toward the house for a simple meal, she ate not out of desperation, but with a calm awareness of capability, recognizing the small, hard-earned victories of endurance, skill, and adaptation. And as the afternoon waned, he walked the property with her, showing her the fences, the barns, the animals, giving brief corrections that were firm but not harsh. And she began to anticipate his expectations, predict his movements, understand the quiet rhythms of the ranch. And in that shared work, she felt the bond deepen, delicate yet tangible, a trust and recognition forged in sweat, effort, and silent acknowledgement. And in the soft bruised light of dusk, she allowed herself to watch him more closely, noting the faint scars on his hands, the strong lines on his face, the patience in his gaze, wondering not with longing, but with curiosity how a man could carry so much strength and solitude, and how perhaps she could meet that strength not with fear but with understanding, cooperation, and resilience. And as the stars blinked awake over the plains, the chores done, the animals settled, he finally gestured her to rest. And in that gesture there was no patronage, no pity, only the quiet acknowledgement of her effort. And she felt a swell of pride, not loud or boastful, but deep and steady, the kind that comes from knowing one has earned a place, a rhythm, a connection. And as she lay down, listening to the whisper of wind, the murmur of the animals, and the vast, unending sky above, she realized that she was no longer merely surviving, no longer wandering aimlessly through the harsh, uncaring world, but living, shaping her own days, meeting challenges, forming bonds, feeling strength, endurance, and the quiet pulse of life. And in that realization, a fragile but persistent hope took root, threading itself through her chest, promising that tomorrow, and all days after, would be met not with fear or despair, but with awareness, effort, courage, and perhaps, in small increments, trust, care, and belonging. And in that quiet surrender to night and the possibilities of life, she finally allowed herself to close her eyes fully, ready to meet the dawn, ready to endure, ready to grow, and knowing that the story she had begun on the endless, lonely road had now found its path toward resolution, and that this chapter 2 ended here, with her strength reclaimed, her spirit tested and surviving, her bond with the man quietly sealed in mutual recognition, sweat, effort, and the unspoken understanding that they were no longer alone. And in that ending, complete and unbroken, she finally knew that life, though still hard, could now be faced with courage, with hope, and with the faint, steady pulse of belonging.